The Late Modern English. The recognition of Late Modern English as a separate period in the history of the English language is a fairly recent phenomenon. However, there are some scholars and academics who championed in the concept of early modern English. Some of them are Pootsma in 1914. So he had a book entitled The Grammar of Late Modern English. According to Pootsma, it's a methodical description of the English language as it presents itself in the printed documents of the last few generations. Also, we have Sweet. So for Sweet, he was a proponent and invented the now familiar tripartite division of the history of English. So for Sweet, he mentioned that it starts with the three main divisions of old, middle, and modern, based mainly on the inflectional characteristics of each stage. His definition of modern English was the period of lost inflections. So, from the 16th century to Sweet's own lifetime. Next, we have Wilde during the 20th century. He mentioned that we should further distinguish early modern from 1400 or so to the middle of the 16th century, and after that it is convenient to distinguish late 16th century, 17th century, and 18th century English, and we may consider present day English to begin towards the end of the 18th century. So he recognized a distinction between early modern English and later history of the language. But, however, it does not see this later period as a coherent entity worth of a single label. For Bael, however, his serious study of this period did not begin until the end of the 20th century, perhaps because it was not until the millennium was in sight, so the 20th century is from the 1900 to 2000, that the late modern period could be seen in historical perspective. Because you cannot really see the difference of the language if it is too close. But if there is already like a long time difference between two periods, that is when you get to start to see the differences in the language. So we also have Charles Jones. There's always been a suggestion, especially among those scholars writing in the first half of the 20th century, that phonological and syntactic change is only properly observable at a great distance. So this is what I mentioned earlier. And this is what you call historical linguistics. And that somehow the 18th and especially the 19th centuries are too close. So that's why chronologically for any meaningful observation concerning language change to be made. Also, Jones has been the pioneer in the study of late modern English. He even organized a conference for this in 2001. So, the proceedings of the conference appeared in Ducena and Jones' Book of Proceedings in 2003. More so, Gorlock has produced separate volumes dedicated to 18th and 19th century English. And it was Bailey in 1996 likewise dealt with the 19th century separately. Bael in 2004 as the first book to cover the whole of this period in a single volume, although the latter defines later modern English as covering the period 1700 to 1945. So the writer here will deal with the period roughly from 1700 to 1900. So writer here is Bael. Now let's go to external history. So this refers to again the socio-historical background of the language. So the division between the early and late modern periods is not defined by a single cataclysmic. When we say cataclysmic, devastating event, yeah, cataclysm, external events such as the Norman conquest. So there was not such event to separate the early and late modern period. There are several factors, however, contributing to the view that a date around 1700 marks the beginning of a new era. So what are these? important events that marked the 1700 as a new era. So 18th century, so that's from 1700 to 1800. So I describe this century as long because it's the beginning of the restoration of the monarchy in England and ending with the fall of Napoleon in 1815. However, they say that 19th century is long because it stretches from the French Revolution to the end of the World War. So as you can see, it's around 1660 to around 1918. So the time is actually quite wide. So there are many changes that happened to the English language during this period. So 1660 is also the year when the Royal Society founded, ushering the Age of Reason. Again, this is still somewhat related to the Renaissance. The Renaissance was the age of enlightenment. They went back to the classical teachings, and it was the great time for scientific discoveries and exploration and widening of knowledge. So, some of the key proponents here are Newton, and some are saying like there are philosophers which contributed to this new age of reason. For example, Rene Descartes, he lived around this time. The famous saying, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. So both Porter 2000 and Lassie 1999 cite the publication of Newton's Principia in 1687 as the beginning of the English Enlightenment. Scientific progress from throughout the late modern period stimulated lexical innovations as new inventions, processes, and whole disciplines required names. So I already mentioned in the early modern English that because um, the Renaissance already occurred there, so there were already borrowings that happened. So those borrowings of terminologies to name, inventions, discoveries, it still continued until the late modern period. So Leonard in 1929 has the doctrine of correctness in which grammatical rules such as the prescription on negative concord, two negatives make a positive, were rationalized on mathematical models. So really they are being scientific during this time. And Britain became an industrial nation. Workers moved from the countryside to the newly expanding towns and cities, especially in the English and North and Midlands. So part of this is, for example, London. As I mentioned earlier, so London and the neighboring areas there was becoming more and more busy. People were going into the capital. There was many trade that was going on during that time, and yeah, many discoveries are being done. So dialectal contact and an awareness of the differences between dialects of English was made possible by advances in transportation and communication. So what were the innovations during this time? So many roads were being built. So of course, new people coming in, bringing their own languages and dialects, travelogues. So these are like catalogs or like magazines about travel. Later on, there was the development of the railway in the 19th century. So this made transportation even faster. And then we have the penny post in 1840. So penny post, it's basically snail mail or mailing using letter, but it was cheap. That's why it's called penny post. So people started to exchange letters because it was affordable because it cost just a penny. And the electric telegraph. What is a telegraph? Um, you send message using Morse code. So it's really the message is more personal between two correspondents. And the phonograph in 1877. What is the phonograph? In Bisaya, we have the plaka. So that's the phonograph. The one you turn the crank so that the big disc, the round disc will produce music. So that's phonograph. So these are some things, some innovations that were introduced during the late modern English period. So the late modern period also marks the beginning of the great divide between British and American English. So great divide because the colonies in America really wanted to create um, their own identity, their own nationalism, and they started with the use of language. So one of the champions for having an American English variety is Webster. So that's the Webster with his dictionary. He like tried to really make a standardized version of the American English, which is very separate or different from British English. So the development of American English as a national variety with its own prescribed norms was precipitated by the American Revolution. 1789, Webster asserted that customs, habits, and language as well as government should be national. So his American Dictionary, as I mentioned, Webster, of the English language provided the norms. So what is the prescribed way for spelling, which were deliberately differentiated from those British English, as well as legitimizing Americanism. So as what I said, they wanted to create their own identity separate from the British English. With the loss of America, British colonial expansion diverted. They started now to expand their colony to Australia because Great Britain was a powerful country back then. And in the later on to South Africa and New Zealand. That was why, if you will take up eventually purposive communication, you will discuss the cut-through circle, the inner circle, outer circle, expanding circle. So you would find out that Australia, America, South Africa, New Zealand, these are what we call as part of the inner circle because when when colonization occurred with the spread of the English language, they were the first one to receive the language, and eventually it became their primary language. So, expansion of British interest both in these colonies and the nations of Africa and Asia absorbed by the British Empire brought into English many words. Of course, language contact will also bring new words. In fact, the English language is not afraid to borrow words from other countries. Just like they borrowed words from the Philippines, like boondocks, which means from the mountain, or they would use Manila, for example, as a material. So this time, Manila is not spelled with a big M, but rather a small m. So for example, a Manila envelope. So they are not afraid to borrow words. So eventually it absorbed by the British Empire brought into English loan words from a wide variety of language such as flora, fauna, topographic features, and customs hitherto unknown to speakers of English required names. So this, along with the scientific discoveries and inventions referred to above, accounts for the increase in lexical innovations during the 19th century. More so, the late modern period led to the emergence of an ambitious and influential middle class. So there was a rise of the middle class during this time. Sometimes they would be labeled as social climbers because they really wanted to assert their power, their authority. So the triumvirate, or the three most famous people during that time, was Johnson, Loth, and Walker. So they created dictionaries, grammar books, pronouncing dictionaries, and published to help those aspiring to linguistic correctness. So there is already a certain level of prescriptiveness during this time. The standards of English that will be discussed here, by the way, for now will only refer to British English. However, when we go to the English in the present, we will be taking up the American English as well. So let's go now to morphology and syntax. Morphology is word formation, syntax is sentence structure. The only inflection to be lost after 1700 is the second person singular st ending, so thou'st. that was lost during this time. And there was also the loss of the distinction between second person singular thou, thee, thy, and thine, and the formal plural ye, you, and yours. So what does this mean? Now they only use you to this, so that there is no distinction anymore between the singular you and the plural you. So that was during the late modern English period, wherein this innovation was um, used. Nevertheless, they probably still wanted to mark a difference between singular and plural. So that's why eventually they introduced this time the word use. And it's a new plural form, and it was being used by Irish, American, and Australian English. This form has spread throughout Britain in the late 20th century. So they removed thou, thee, thy, and ye, you, your, and yours, and just stuck with you for singular and you for plural. But eventually later on, they introduced use, so that there will be a distinguishing mark for singularity and plurality. So the syntactic changes in the late modern period can be divided into two. So the changes that started in the early modern period and the changes that were really new during this century, the 18th and 19th century. So one important syntactic feature that started during the early modern period was the use of the auxiliary do. So there were many functions of the use of do at this time, because do could be used as you could say something declarative emphatic with do, but you could also say something, a word, to make without saying do. For example, I could say I do like it, but you could also say I like it. So there was really much attention to the auxiliary verb do. So where are the attention? Where is the attention being focused on? So Eligard, by the way, provided a graph demonstrating the decline of the construction, the use of do as an auxiliary, reaching close to zero by 1700. However, Zieken found that during the 18th century, there were still prose. When we say prose, um, these are store on fiction. So short stories, novels, those are examples for prose. People still use the construction, but it was rare. So it started to die out at 1700, and it was rarely used in fiction. But it was still alive, but rarely used. Also in poetry, they also used the do construction. So the semantically empty auxiliary provided an extra syllable when needed. So because sometimes when you write poetry, you need to count the number of syllables. So so that there will be a rhyming number of syllables. That's why sometimes poet would add do. For example, the hapless creature, the, that's one syllable. Hapless, three. Creature, that's five. Which, that's six. Let's say if we remove dwell, I mean did, so, and you proceed to dwell, so there's just seven syllables. The hapless creature which dwell, that's just seven syllables. And then if you want to have like a rhyming and a parallel couplet or two lines, you you need to have like the same number of syllables. So for example, ear, while, that's two. Within, that's four. The, dan, that's six. Sing, shall, so that's eight. So if you remove did, so that would only be seven syllables, and then the second line is eight syllables, so that it will facilitate the rhyme scheme, the number of syllables. That's why poets still continued to use the do auxiliary construction. So that's why the hapless creature which did well, that's now 8 syllables, and Irwal within the dancing shell, so that's another 8 syllable. So to facilitate the rhyming and the number of syllables. So in early modern variants, they persisted into the 18th century is the use of negation. Elegard shows the use of do in negative declaratives. So, for example, I say, I do not like it. So these are negative declaratives. And he found that there was a corpus rising to 80% by 1700. So the use of do plus negative declarative as a negative declarative, with the steepest rise in this usage coming in the second half of the 17th century. Another syntactic innovation that started from the early modern English period to the late modern English period is the use of relativization. So relativization refers to relative pronouns, for example, who, whom, whose, and which. They're actually already used before, but the options now of using this for human and human antecedents, using a zero or contact relative in both subject and object position were still available. So they continued to still use the relative pronouns at this time. Next, let's go to the syntax, the innovations of the late modern period. So these are the innovations that are really new. They are not similar to the do construction, the relative pronouns that were just a continuation from the early modern English period. So what are these new innovations at this time? So the be plus ing construction, the progressive form, also known as the expanded form. For example, she is reading a book. However, if you remember in the early modern period, they already started using be plus ing, but it's mentioned here that the construction had been used before 1700. So that's probably why. And perhaps the author of this article and the author of the early modern English period article, probably they had different sources. Their findings were somewhat different, so that's probably why they did not see that the be plus ing was already mentioned in the early modern English period. So this could actually probably be transferred to the previous um, previous previous slides. However, so we go with what Bael is saying. So he's also saying that being could probably be a new innovation in this particular time. So although this construction has been used before 1700, for example, in Hamlet, what do you read, my lord? So it has the same thought as what are you reading, my lord? So there is a concept of like a progressive uh, sentence here. So Hamlet, by the way, was written by Shakespeare. So that's before the 1700s. So also several studies have noted the increase in the usage of be plus ing construction throughout the late modern period. So probably it started before 1700. However, there was an increase in the usage. So it probably became more prominent during 1700 to the 1900 period. So another innovation is that while examples of the upprinting type are found in early 18th century literature, so a plus word plus ing, by the 19th century they are still being used. For example, if you sing the song 12 Days of Christmas, 8 lords a leaping. So that's a plus leap plus ing. However, this is somewhat frowned upon because they say that this is a lower class usage and it is uneducated. So during this time also, these were some syntactic innovations. The use of be plus ing, and then for construction to longer verb phrases involving perfective and modal verbs. In the present, we have the perfect progressive tense. For example, you would say, I have been eating the cake. Have plus verb plus ing. So that's the perfective um, form there for perfective progressive. And this was also introduced during this time. However, it took a longer time to be realized. Also, during this particular period, because people were becoming more scientific, that's why multiple negations disappeared, because again, two negatives make a positive. Also, grammarians condemned preposition stranding. So when we say preposition, um, it's a marker that you put before another noun to show the relationship between two nouns. So what happens in preposition stranding? A preposition is stranded. So basically, it needs to follow the noun or phrase, or it needs to be before the noun or the phrase. But the noun or the pronoun. However, in this particular case, the noun or the pronoun is not um, following the it's not right after the preposition. For example, you would say, who did you talk to? Question. So supposedly, the the question should be, did you talk to who? But I guess that would sound awkward, right? So that's why you need to transfer the who to the beginning part. Who did you talk to? So to is the preposition, and it's stranded because it is not attached right away to the word who. Next is the concept of split infinitive. So when we say split infinitive, the infinitive form is to plus verb. However, um, the split infinitive, you insert something between the to and the verb. For example, you would say that that invention, or let's say that idea seems to really work. So you are saying to plus really plus work. Instead of saying that invention seems to work, you are saying that invention seems to really work. So you're adding really in between to and work. So it became a split infinitive, and that's being condemned by grammarians. However, it is a shibboleth to this day. So when we say shibboleth, it's being used, or that that structure is being attached to certain, probably you could call it like register of certain people, and it's usually not of a big deal to discuss this. To some to some they may call this as error, but it's not really that important to most people. Next, let's go to phonology, or the sound systems. So the late modern English has until very recently had much less scholarly attention paid to it than that of the earlier periods. It's probably because, as McMahon suggests, superficially the period under consideration might appear to contain little of phonetic and phonological interest compared with, for example, earlier changes, because, like, for example, you had the Great Vowel Shift, and also from the early modern English period to the late modern English period, probably they did not have that much of a difference. That's why um, not too many academicians and scholars really studied the phonology of the late modern English period. However, these were some of the very observable things during this period. So the rhoticity, the strength of R, so that's one phenomenon that they were able to find out during this period. So there was a loss of rhoticity as attested. So there is a lack of the strength of R. For example, you say road, but in British, if you put the R at the end, it becomes less rhotic. So it, for example, you would say butter. So you don't say butter, you would say butter. So it started to lose its rhoticity during this time. So the loss of rhoticity is attested by Walker. It's one of the first sources of evidence for this change. But he considers this to be a marker of lower class London usage. So right now, if we hear people speaking without an R at the end of their words, um, we could probably like associate them with Great Britain or something like that, somewhere in England, and we find it nice, right? However, there is actually like a negative emotion attached to the people of England during this particular time because they associated it with you being member of the lower class if you are losing the rhoticity of your R. So in England, particularly in London, the R in laud, bod, cod, regard is pronounced so much in the throat, ah. So laud, bod. So as to be little more than the middle or Italian, a lengthened into ba, bod, cod, regard. So that was a phenomenon that was really like very prominent during this time in London and England. So for the Irish, the pronunciation of R is too harsh. Irish. So, but to say that the pronunciation at the beginning of a word should be more forcible than compared to the end. So that's Rome, river, rage. We have the forcible R as like the similar in Ireland. But ba, bot, cod, hot must have it nearly as soft as in London. But if it's towards the end, there is a losing rhoticity to the R. According to Walker, R was considerably weakened in final and preconsonant position. That's why, as I mentioned, ba, bod, cod. So R was losing its rhoticity. So dropping of R continued to be overtly stigmatized. So stigmatized, that's like something negative emotion towards that because again, they would associate that with the lower class, the uneducated. But for today, we actually like to listen to British speakers, right? When they don't have a letter R. But during this time, there's a negative connotation to that. Mm, so that you'll have an appreciation better of what the stigmatism as being stigmatized sound is. For example, for the people of Manila, when they hear Cebuanos have a punto, like we speak na gahe Tagalog, they would usually have a negative association with that. They would sometimes ridicule us. For example, ati, ati, saan ka pupunta? So something like that. So it's being stigmatized. So it's same with this case. So during that time, if they hear that you're losing your R's, so there is like a negative connotation to that. So it appears to have been a change from below. So from the lower class, the loss of R. First noticed in lower class London English of the late 18th century, eventually to find its way into received pronunciation in the 20th century. So when we say received pronunciation, so that's the pronunciation being used right now in London, in Great Britain. In the 20th century, rhoticity became recessive even in regional dialects of England, remaining as a marker mainly of southwestern and some Lancashire dialects. So also during this time, the phenomenon of the dropping of the H and the G occurred. It actually was mentioned a bit in the early modern English period. For example, it was the helmet instead of saying helmet. So if you drop your H, that's also vulgar or incorrect. So instead of saying helmet, you should say instead of saying helmet, you should say helmet. It's the H droppings, the omission of the aspirated in many words by some. So aspiration, for example, W, you put an H, so that's an example of aspiration. So if you drop H, that's being vulgar. So you should not say which, rather you should say which. Because if you remove the H, it's as if you would it's like you're dropping H in certain words which need an H. Like you don't say how, you don't say house, instead you say house. But in some certain French word, it was still acceptable, like our, honor, herb, and other derivatives. Let's now go to the vowels. One of the clearest and most persistent markers for the north-south divide of the English accent is the presence of or the stressed schwa. So schwa could be stressed or unstressed. This is a mid vowel. So for example, you would say burger. So bur, this is the schwa that you would use. But for the other syllable ger, this is the schwa that you would use. So that's bur, ger, something like that. Um, the stress schwa also is pronounced blood, cup, put. And this had been established in the mid 18th century. So also during this time, for the north and south divide, the pronunciation of the vowel of, as in bath, laugh, grass, has a more complex history. Evidence of lengthening of the American a, in certain environments, mainly before voiceless fricative. For example, S is a fricative and it's voiceless. So grass. So that's a quality um, of the north accent. And there's also the concept of preconsonantal, mainly also before voiceless fricatives, preconsonantals but not final R, and the use of N. For example, the use of N before followed by another consonant. For example, dance. So the use of N and fricative S. So dance. So you would know that they're from the north if they have that kind of the use of the letter A. This occurred in the late 17th century, but throughout the 18th, 19th century, the pronunciation with was not universally accepted. But today, you could actually hear people say as in bath. This change seems to have begun as a lengthened so from to in the 17th century, and not to have become stigmatized until the lengthened vowel was retracted to ah. The lengthening of short O to oo. For example, oof, cloth, cruise. So there is like a lengthening of the O. So instead of off, cloth, cross, you would say oof, cloth, cruise. So that's very British English. However, if you use that, again, there is a negative connotation to that because they feel that is somewhat vulgar. So they also point out that both as in bath and as in off were condemned also as vulgar. So if you use oo, and so these are all vulgar. So the Middle English vowels also had been raised to oo, respectively. And these are the pronunciation described by Walker, who writes the long, slender sound of and the long, open sound of oo, so respectively. Next, let's go to lexical innovations. So during this time, again, they borrowed many lexicons because, of course, trade, exploration, colonization, and discovery of science. So there was an influx of French military terminologies, and apart from French, again, because they went back to the classic, there were also borrowings from Latin and Greek. So examples from 1753 are aeronautics, azalea, caldarium from Latin, and etymological eczema and splenitis from Greek. So new words formed from classical roots was to increase substantially later on, even in the 19th century. Again, people were becoming more and more scientific. They quested for knowledge. Scientific discoveries and inventions of the 19th century were given names coined from classical roots. Example, in 1835, bifurcate, capilliform, locomotory from Latin, and creosote, phonograph, and silo from Greek. The new science, geology, also provided many words. So, study of the earth. So, for example, minerals, bromide, lanarkite, ledellite, prostite, smithsonite, stromayerite, strustite, uralite, and voltzite. So many ites. And late modern period progresses, words are imported into English from a wider variety of language because again the Great Britain had many colonies by this time. So because they already becoming weak with their contact with the North America. That's why they started to explore Americas, Asias, Africas, and of Australia. So they also borrowed words from that. For example, the language in New Zealand, the words kiwi, rata, and tui are first cited all from Maori. So these are from New Zealand, which is the neighbor of Australia. So because they expanded their colonies even to those places. So they all also had contact to new words to these places. So here's a figure showing the number of first citations in the Oxford English Dictionary. So as you can see, the peak of the new words borrowed in the English language was in around 1841 to 1850. At this time, they already started to borrow around 2,500 words. But if you accumulate all of these borrowings, English has really borrowed lots and lots of words. So that's the end of my discussion. This is my reference and the end. Thank you for listening.